Book 3, Chapter 3 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Catharine Eastman. Chapter the 3rd, Young Caddles in London. 1. All unaware of the trend of events, unaware of the laws that were closing in upon all the brethren, unaware indeed that there lived a brother for him on the earth, young Caddles chose this time to come out of his chalk pit and see the world. His brooding came at last to that. There was no answer to all his questions in Cheesing Eyebright. The new vicar was less luminous even than the old, and the riddle of his pointless labor grew at last to the dimensions of exasperation. "Why should I work in this pit day after day?" he asked. "Why should I walk within bounds, and be refused all the wonders of the world beyond there? What have I done to be condemned to this?" And one day he stood up, straightened his back, and said in a loud voice, "No, I won't," he said, and then, with great vigor, cursed the pit. Then, having few words, he sought to express his thought in acts. He took a truck half filled with chalk, lifted it, and flung it, smash, against another. Then he grasped a whole row of empty trucks and spun them down a bank. He sent a huge boulder of chalk bursting among them, and then ripped up a dozen yards of rail with a mighty plunge of his foot. So he commenced the conscientious wrecking of the pit. "Work all my days," he said, "at this." It was an astonishing 5 minutes for the little geologist he had, in his preoccupation, overlooked. This poor little creature, having dodged 2 boulders by a hairbreadth, got out by the westward corner and fled athwart the hill, with flapping rucksack and twinkling knickerbockered legs, leaving a trail of Cretaceous echinoderms behind him, while young Caddles, satisfied with the destruction he had achieved, came striding out to fulfill his purpose in the world. "Work in that old pit until I die and rot and stink? What worm did they think was living in my giant body? Dig chalk for God knows what foolish purpose? Not I." The trend of road and railway, perhaps, or mere chance it was, turned his face to London, and thither he came striding, over the downs and athwart the meadows, through the hot afternoon, to the infinite amazement of the world. It signified nothing to him that torn posters in red and white, bearing various names, flapped from every wall and barn. He knew nothing of the electoral revolution that had flung Caterham, Jack the Giant Killer, into power. It signified nothing to him that every police station along his route had what was known as Caterham's ukase upon its notice board that afternoon, proclaiming that no giant, no person whatever over 8 feet in height, should go more than 5 miles from his place of location without a special permission. It signified nothing to him that, on his wake, belated police officers, not a little relieved to find themselves belated, shook warning handbills at his retreating back. He was going to see what the world had to show him, poor incredulous blockhead, and he did not mean that occasional spirited persons shouting "Aye!" at him should stay his course. He came on down by Rochester and Greenwich, towards an ever-thickening aggregation of houses, walking rather slowly now, staring about him, and swinging his huge chopper. People in London had heard something of him before, how that he was idiotic but gentle, and wonderfully managed by Lady Wondershoot's agent and the vicar, how in his dull way he revered these authorities, and was grateful to them for their care of him, and so forth. So that when they learnt from the newspaper placards that afternoon that he also was on strike, the thing appeared to many of them as a deliberate concerted act. "They mean to try our strength," said the men in the trains going home from business. "Lucky we have Caterham." "It's in answer to his proclamation." The men in the clubs were better informed. They clustered round the tape, or talked in groups in their smoking rooms. "He has no weapons. He would have gone to Sevenoaks if he had been put up to it." "Caterham will handle him," the shopmen told their customers. The waiters in restaurants snatched a moment for an evening paper between the courses. The cabmen read it immediately after the betting news. The placards of the chief government evening paper were conspicuous with "Grasping the Nettle." Others relied for effect on "Giant Redwood continues to meet the princess." The Echo struck a line of its own with Rumoured revolt of giants in the north of England. The Sunderland giants start for Scotland. The Westminster Gazette sounded its usual warning note. Giants beware, said the Westminster Gazette, and tried to make a point out of it that might perhaps serve towards uniting the Liberal party, at that time greatly torn between 7 intensely egotistical leaders. The later newspapers dropped into uniformity. The giant in the New Kent Road, they proclaimed. What I want to know, said the pale young man in the cheese shop, is why we aren't getting any news of the young Cossers. You'd think they'd be in it most of all. They tell me there's another of them young giants got loose, said the barmaid, wiping out a glass. I've always said they was dangerous things to have about, right away from the beginning. It ought to be put a stop to. Anyhow, I hope he won't come along here. I'd like to have a look at him, said the young man at the bar recklessly, and added, I seen the princess. Do you think they'll hurt him? Said the barmaid. May have to, said the young man at the bar, finishing his glass. Amidst a hum of 10 million such sayings, young Cattles came to London. 2. I think of young Cattles always as he was seen in the New Kent Road, the sunset warm upon his perplexed and staring face. The road was thick with its varied traffic, omnibuses, trams, vans, carts, trolleys, cyclists, motors, and a marvelling crowd. Loafers, women, nursemaids, shopping women, children, venturesome hobbledehoys, gathered behind his gingerly moving feet. The hoardings were untidy everywhere with the tattered election paper. A babblement of voices surged about him. One sees the customers and shopmen crowding in the doorways of the shops, the faces that came and went at the windows, the little street boys running and shouting, the policemen taking it all quite stiffly and calmly, the workmen knocking off upon scaffoldings, the seething miscellany of the little folks. They shouted to him, vague encouragement, vague insults, the imbecile catchwords of the day, and he stared down at them, at such a multitude of living creatures as he had never before imagined in the world. Now that he had fairly entered London, he had had to slacken his pace more and more, the little folks crowded so mightily upon him. The crowd grew denser at every step, and, at last, at a corner where 2 great ways converged, he came to a stop, and the multitude flowed about him and closed him in. There he stood, with his feet a little apart, his back to a big corner gin palace that towered twice his height and ended in a sky sign, staring down at the pygmies and wondering, trying, I doubt not, to collate it all with the other things of his life, with the valley among the downlands, the nocturnal lovers, the singing in the church, the chalk he hammered daily, and with instinct and death and the sky, trying to see it all together coherent and significant. His brows were knit. He put up his huge paw to scratch his coarse hair, and groaned aloud. I don't see it, he said. His accent was unfamiliar. A great babblement went across the open space, a babblement amidst which the gongs of the trams, ploughing their obstinate way through the mass, rose like red poppies amidst corn. What did he say? Said he didn't see. Said, where is the sea? Said, where's a seat? He wants a seat. Can't the brasted fool sit on a house or something? What are ye for, ye swarming little people? What are ye all doing? What are ye all for? What are ye doing up here, ye swarming little people, while I'm a-cutting chalk for you down in the chalk pits there? His queer voice, the voice that had been so bad for school discipline at Cheesing Eyebright, smote the multitude to silence while it sounded and splashed them all to tumult at the end. Some wit was audible, screaming, Speech! Speech! What's he saying? Was the burden of the public mind, and an opinion was abroad that he was drunk. Aye, 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 bawled the omnibus drivers, threading a dangerous way. A drunken American sailor wandered about cheerfully inquiring, What's he want, anyhow? A leathery-faced rag dealer upon a little pony-drawn cart soared up over the tumult by virtue of his voice. Garn home, you brasted giant, he bawled. Garn home, you brasted great dangerous thing. Can't you see you're a-frightening the horses? Go home with you. Hasn't anyone had the sense to tell you the law?" And over all this uproar, young Caddles stared, perplexed, expectant, saying no more. Down a side road came a little string of solemn policemen, and threaded itself ingeniously into the traffic. "Stand back," said the little voices. "Keep moving, please." Young Caddles became aware of a little dark blue figure thumping at his shin. He looked down and perceived 2 white hands gesticulating. "What?" he said, bending forward. "Can't stand about here," shouted the inspector. "No, you can't stand about here," he repeated. "But where am I to go?" "Back to your village, place of location. Anyhow, now, you've got to move on. You're obstructing the traffic." "What traffic?" "Along the road." "But where is it going? Where does it come from? What does it mean? They're all round me. What do they want? What are they doing? I want to understand. I'm tired of cutting chalk and being all alone. What are they doing for me while I'm a-cutting chalk? I may just as well understand here and now as anywhere." "Sorry, but we aren't here to explain things of that sort. I must ask you to move on." "Don't you know?" "I must ask you to move on, if you please. I'd strongly advise you to get off home. We've had no special instructions yet, but it's against the law. Clear away there, clear away." The pavement to his left became invitingly bare, and young Caddles went slowly on his way. But now his tongue was loosened. "I don't understand," he muttered. "I don't understand." He would appeal brokenly to the changing crowd that ever trailed beside him and behind. "I didn't know there was such places as this. What are all you people doing with yourselves? What's it all for? What is it all for, and where do I come in?" He had already begotten a new catchword. Young men of wit and spirit addressed each other in this manner. "Hullo, Ariocock! What's it all for, eh? What's it all bloomin' well for?" To which there sprang up a competing variety of repartees, for the most part impolite. The most popular and best adapted for general use appears to have been, "Shut it!" or, in a voice of scornful detachment, "Garn!" There were others almost equally popular. 3. What was he seeking? He wanted something the pygmy world did not give, some end which the pygmy world prevented his attaining, prevented even his seeing clearly, which he was never to see clearly. It was the whole gigantic social side of this lonely dumb monster crying out for his race, for the things akin to him, for something he might love, and something he might serve, for a purpose he might comprehend, and a command he could obey. And all this was dumb, raged dumbly within him, could not even, had he met a fellow giant, have found outlet and expression in speech. All the life he knew was the dull round of the village. All the speech he knew was the talk of the cottage, that failed and collapsed at the bare outline of his least gigantic need. He knew nothing of money, this monstrous simpleton, nothing of trade, nothing of the complex pretenses upon which the social fabric of the little folks was built. He needed... Whatever he needed, he never found his need. All through the day and the summer night he wandered, growing hungry, but as yet untired, marking the varied traffic of the different streets, the inexplicable businesses of all these infinitesimal beings. In the aggregate, it had no other color than confusion for him. He is said to have plucked a lady from her carriage in Kensington, a lady in evening dress of the smartest sort, to have scrutinized her closely, train and shoulder blades, and to have replaced her, a little carelessly, with the profoundest sigh. For that I cannot vouch. For an hour or so he watched people fighting for places in the omnibuses at the end of Piccadilly. He was seen looming over Kennington Oval for some moments in the afternoon, but when he saw these dense thousands were engaged with the mystery of cricket, and quite regardless of him, he went his way with a groan. He came back to Piccadilly Circus between 11 and 12 at night, and found a new sort of multitude. Clearly they were very intent, full of things they, for inconceivable reasons, might do, and of others they might not do. They stared at him, and jeered at him, and went their way. The cabmen, vulture-eyed, followed one another continually along the edge of the swarming pavement. People emerged from the restaurants or entered them, grave, intent, dignified, or gently and agreeably excited, or keen and vigilant, beyond the cheating of the sharpest waiter born. The great giant, standing at his corner, peered at them all. "What is it all for?" he murmured in a mournful, vast undertone. "What is it all for? They are all so earnest. What is it I do not understand?" And none of them seemed to see, as he could do, the drink-sodden wretchedness of the painted women at the corner, the ragged misery that sneaked along the gutters, the infinite futility of all this employment. The infinite futility. None of them seemed to feel the shadow of that giant's need, that shadow of the future that lay athwart their paths. Across the road, high up, mysterious letters flamed and went, that might, could he have read them, have measured for him the dimensions of human interest, have told him of the fundamental needs and features of life as the little folks conceived it. First would come a flaming T, then U would follow, T-U, then P, T-U-P, until at last there stood complete across the sky this cheerful message to all who felt the burden of life's earnestness. Tupper's Tonic Wine for Vigor. Snap, and it had vanished into the night, to be followed in the same slow development by a second universal solicitude. Beauty soap. Not, you remark, mere cleansing chemicals, but something, as they say, ideal. And then, completing the tripod of the little life, Yanker's Yellow Pills. After that, there was nothing for it but Tupper again, in flaming crimson letters, snap, snap, across the void. T-U-P-P. Early in the small hours, it would seem that young Caddles came to the shadowy quiet of Regent's Park, stepped over the railings, and lay down on a grassy slope near where the people skate in winter-time, and there he slept an hour or so. And about 6 o'clock in the morning, he was talking to a draggled woman he had found sleeping in a ditch near Hampstead Heath, asking her very earnestly what she thought she was for. 4. The wandering of Caddles about London came to a head on the second day in the morning, for then his hunger overcame him. He hesitated where the hot-smelling loaves were being tossed into a cart, and then, very quietly, knelt down and commenced robbery. He emptied the cart while the baker's man fled for the police, and then his great hand came into the shop and cleared counter and cases. Then, with an armful, still eating, he went his way looking for another shop to go on with his meal. It happened to be one of those seasons when work is scarce and food dear, and the crowd in that quarter was sympathetic, even with a giant, who took the food they all desired. They applauded the second phase of his meal, and laughed at his stupid grimace at the policeman. "I was hungry," he said with his mouth full. "Bravo!" cried the crowd. "Bravo!" Then, when he was beginning his third baker's shop, he was stopped by half a dozen policemen hammering with truncheons at his shins. "Look here, my fine giant, you come along of me," said the officer in charge. "You ain't allowed away from home like this. You come off home with me." They did their best to arrest him. There was a trolley, I am told, chasing up and down streets at that time, bearing rolls of chain and ship's cable to play the part of handcuffs in that great arrest. There was no intention then of killing him. "He is no party to the plot," Caterham had said. "I will not have innocent blood upon my hands." And added, "until everything else has been tried." At first Caddles did not understand the import of these attentions. When he did, he told the policemen not to be fools, and set off in great strides that left them all behind. The bakers' shops had been in the Harrow Road, and he went through Canal London to St. John's Wood, and sat down in a private garden there to pick his teeth, and be speedily assailed by another posse of constables. "You leave me alone," he growled, and slouched through the gardens, spoiling several lawns and kicking down a fence or so, while the energetic little policeman followed him up, some through the gardens, some along the road in front of the houses. Here there were one or two with guns, but they made no use of them. When he came out into the Edgware Road, there was a new note and a new movement in the crowd, and a mounted policeman rode over his foot and got upset for his pains. "You leave me alone," said Caddles, facing the breathless crowd. "I ain't done anything to you." At that time he was unarmed, for he had left his chalk chopper in Regent's Park. But now, poor wretch, he seems to have felt the need of some weapon. He turned back towards the goods yard of the Great Western Railway, wrenched up the standard of a tall arc light, a formidable mace for him, and flung it over his shoulder. And finding the police still turning up to pester him, he went back along the Edgware Road towards Cricklewood and struck off sullenly to the north. He wandered as far as Waltham, and then turned back westward, and then again towards London, and came by the cemeteries and over the crest of Highgate about midday into view of the greatness of the city again. He turned aside and sat down in a garden with his back to a house that overlooked all London. He was breathless, and his face was lowering, and now the people no longer crowded upon him as they had done when first he came to London, but lurked in the adjacent garden and peeped from cautious securities. They knew by now the thing was grimmer than they had thought. "Why can't they leave me alone?" growled young Caddles. "I must eat. Why can't they leave me alone?" He sat with a darkling face, gnawing at his knuckles and looking down over London. All the fatigue, worry, perplexity, and impotent wrath of his wanderings was coming to a head in him. "They mean nothing," he whispered. "They mean nothing, and they won't let me alone, and they will get in my way." And again, over and over to himself, "Meanin' nothing. The little people." He bit harder at his knuckles, and his scowl deepened. "Cuttin' chalk for 'em," he whispered, "and all the world is theirs. I don't come in nowhere." Presently, with a spasm of sick anger, he saw the now familiar form of a policeman astride the garden wall. "Leave me alone," grunted the giant. "Leave me alone." "I got to do my duty," said the little policeman, with a face that was white and resolute. "You leave me alone. I got to live as well as you. I got to think. I got to eat. You leave me alone." "It's the law," said the little policeman, coming no further. "We never made the law." "Nor me," said young Caddles. "You little people made all that before I was born. You and your law. What I must and what I mustn't. No food for me to eat unless I work as a slave. No rest, no shelter, nothing. And you tell me—" "I ain't got no business with that," said the policeman. "I'm not one to argue. All I got to do is to carry out the law." And he brought his second leg over the wall and seemed disposed to get down. Other policemen appeared behind him. "I got no quarrel with you, mind," said young Caddles, with his grip tight upon his huge mace of iron, his face pale, and a lank explanatory great finger to the policeman. "I got no quarrel with you, but you leave me alone." The policeman tried to be calm and commonplace, with a monstrous tragedy clear before his eyes. "Give me the proclamation," he said to some unseen follower, and a little white paper was handed to him. "Leave me alone," said Caddles, scowling, tense, and drawn together. "This means," said the policeman before he read, "go home. Go home to your chalk pit. If not, you'll be hurt." Caddles gave an inarticulate growl. Then, when the proclamation had been read, the officer made a sign. 4 men with rifles came into view and took up positions of affected ease along the wall. They wore the uniform of the rat police. At the sight of the guns, young Caddles blazed into anger. He remembered the sting of the Rexstone farmers' shotguns. "You going to shoot those off at me?" he said, pointing, and it seemed to the officer he must be afraid. "If you don't march back to your pit." Then, in an instant, the officer had slung himself back over the wall, and 60 feet above him, the great electric standard whirled down to his death. Bang, bang, bang went the heavy guns, and smash, the shattered wall, the soil and subsoil of the garden flew. Something flew with it that left red drops on one of the shooter's hands. The rifleman dodged this way and that, and turned valiantly to fire again. But young Caddles, already shot twice through the body, had spun about to find who it was had hit him so heavily in the back. Bang! Bang! He had a vision of houses and greenhouses and gardens, of people dodging at windows, the whole swaying fearfully and mysteriously. He seems to have made 3 stumbling strides, to have raised and dropped his huge mace, and to have clutched his chest. He was stung and wrenched by pain. What was this, warm and wet on his hand? One man, peering from a bedroom window, saw his face, saw him staring with a grimace of weeping dismay at the blood upon his hand, and then his knees bent under him, and he came crashing to earth, the first of the giant nettles to fall to Caterham's resolute clutch, the very last that he had reckoned would come into his hand. Chapter the 4th. Redwood's 2 Days. 1. So soon as Caterham knew the moment for grasping his nettle had come, he took the law into his own hands and sent to arrest Cossor and Redwood. Redwood was there for the taking. He had been undergoing an operation in the side, and the doctors had kept all disturbing things from him until his convalescence was assured. Now they had released him. He was just out of bed, sitting in a fire-warmed room, with a heap of newspapers about him, reading for the first time of the agitation that had swept the country into the hands of Caterham, and of the trouble that was darkening over the princess and his son. It was in the morning of the day when young Caddles died, and when the policeman tried to stop young Redwood on his way to the princess. The latest newspapers Redwood had did but vaguely prefigure these imminent things. He was rereading these first adumbrations of disaster with a sinking heart, reading the shadow of death more and more perceptibly into them, reading to occupy his mind until further news should come. When the officers followed the servant into his room, he looked up eagerly. "I thought it was an early evening paper," he said. Then, standing up and with a swift change of manner, "What's this?" After that, Redwood had no news of anything for 2 days. They had come with a vehicle to take him away, but when it became evident that he was ill, it was decided to leave him for a day or so until he could be safely removed, and his house was taken over by the police and converted into a temporary prison. It was the same house in which Giant Redwood had been born, and in which Heracleophobia had for the first time been given to a human being, and Redwood had now been a widower and had lived alone in it 8 years. He had become an iron-gray man, with a little pointed gray beard, and still active brown eyes. He was slender and soft-voiced, as he had ever been, but his features had now that indefinable quality that comes of brooding over mighty things. To the arresting officer, his appearance was in impressive contrast to the enormity of his offenses. "Here's this feller," said the officer in command to his next subordinate, "has done his level best to bust up everything, and he's got a face like a quiet country gentleman. And here's Judge Hangbrow keeping everything nice and in order for everyone, and he's got a head like a hog. Then they're manners. One all consideration and the other snort and grunt, which just shows you, doesn't it, that appearances aren't to be gone upon, whatever else you do." But his praise of Redwood's consideration was presently dashed. The officers found him troublesome at first, until they had made it clear that it was useless for him to ask questions or beg for papers. They made a sort of inspection of his study, indeed, and cleared away even the papers he had. Redwood's voice was high and expostulatory. "But don't you see?" he said over and over again. "It's my son, my only son, that is in this trouble. It isn't the food I care for, but my son." "I wish indeed I could tell you, sir," said the officer. "But our orders are strict." "Who gave the orders?" cried Redwood. "Ah, that, sir," said the officer, and moved towards the door. "He's going up and down his room," said the second officer, when his superior came down. "That's all right, he'll walk it off a bit." "I hope he will," said the chief officer. "The fact is, I didn't see it in that light before, but this here giant what's been going on with the princess, you know, is this man's son." The two regarded one another and the third policeman for a space. "Then it is a bit rough on him," the third policeman said. It became evident that Redwood had still imperfectly apprehended the fact that an iron curtain had dropped between him and the outer world. They heard him go to the door, try the handle and rattle the lock, and then the voice of the officer who was stationed on the landing telling him it was no good to do that. Then afterwards they heard him at the windows, and saw the men outside looking up. "It's no good that way," said the second officer. Then Redwood began upon the bell. The senior officer went up and explained very patiently that it could do no good to ring the bell like that, and if it was rung for nothing now, it might have to be disregarded presently when he had need of something. "Any reasonable attendance, sir," the officer said. "But if you ring it just by way of protest, we shall be obliged, sir, to disconnect." The last word the officer heard was Redwood's high-pitched, "But at least you might tell me of my son." 2. After that, Redwood spent most of his time at the windows. But the windows offered him little of the march of events outside. It was a quiet street at all times, and that day it was unusually quiet. Scarcely a cab, scarcely a tradesman's cart passed all that morning. Now and then men went by, without any distinctive air of events. Now and then a little group of children, a nursemaid, and a woman going shopping, and so forth. They came onto the stage, right or left, up or down the street, with an exasperating suggestion of indifference to any concerns more spacious than their own. They would discover the police-guarded house with amazement, and exit in the opposite direction, where the great trusses of a giant hydrangea hung across the pavement, staring back or pointing. Now and then a man would come and ask one of the policemen a question, and get a curt reply. Opposite, the houses seemed dead. A housemaid appeared once at a bedroom window and stared for a space, and it occurred to Redwood to signal to her. For a time she watched his gestures as if with interest, and made a vague response to them, then looked over her shoulder suddenly and turned and went away. An old man hobbled out of number 37 and came down the steps and went off to the right, altogether without looking up. For 10 minutes, the only occupant of the road was a cat. With such events, that interminable, momentous morning lengthened out. About 12, there came a bawling of news vendors from the adjacent road, but it passed. Contrary to their wont, they left Redwood Street alone, and a suspicion dawned upon him that the police were guarding the end of the street. He tried to open the window, but this brought a policeman into the room forthwith. The clock of the parish church struck 12, and, after an abyss of time, 1. They mocked him with lunch. He ate a mouthful, and tumbled the food about a little in order to get it taken away, drank freely of whiskey, and then took a chair and went back to the window. The minutes expanded into grey immensities, and for a time, perhaps, he slept. He woke with a vague impression of remote concussions. He perceived a rattling of the windows like the quiver of an earthquake that lasted for a minute or so and died away. Then, after a silence, it returned. Then it died away again. He fancied it might be merely the passage of some heavy vehicle along the main road. What else could it be? After a time he began to doubt whether he had heard this sound. He began to reason interminably with himself. Why, after all, was he seized? Caterham had been in office 2 days, just long enough to grasp his nettle. Grasp his nettle! Grasp his giant nettle! The refrain, once started, sang through his mind and would not be dismissed. What, after all, could Caterham do? He was a religious man. He was bound, in a sort of way, by that, not to do violence without a cause. Grasp his nettle? Perhaps, for example, the princess was to be seized and sent abroad. There might be trouble with his son. In which case... But why had he been arrested? Why was it necessary to keep him in ignorance of a thing like that? The thing suggested something more extensive. Perhaps, for example, they meant to lay all the giants by the heels. They were all to be arrested together. There had been hints of that in the election speeches. And then? No doubt they had got Cossar also. Caterham was a religious man. Redwood clung to that. The back of his mind was a black curtain, and on that curtain there came and went a word written in letters of fire. He struggled perpetually against that word. It was always, as it were, beginning to get written on the curtain and never getting completed. He faced it, at last. Massacre. There was the word in its full brutality. No, it was impossible. Caterham was a religious man, a civilized man. And besides, after all these years, after all these hopes... Redwood sprang up. He paced the room. He spoke to himself. He shouted, "No!" Mankind was surely not so mad as that. Surely not. It was impossible. It was incredible. It could not be. What good would it do to kill the giant human when the gigantic in all the lower things had now inevitably come? They could not be so mad as that. "I must dismiss such an idea," he said aloud. "Dismiss such an idea, absolutely." He pulled up short. What was that? Certainly the windows had rattled. He went to look out into the street. Opposite, he saw the instant confirmation of his ears. At a bedroom at number 35 was a woman, towel in hand, and at the dining room of number 37 a man was visible behind a great vase of hypertrophied maidenhair fern, both staring out and up, both disquieted and curious. He could see now, too, quite clearly, that the policeman on the pavement had heard it also. The thing was not his imagination. He turned to the darkling room. "Guns," he said. He brooded. Guns? They brought him in strong tea, such as he was accustomed to have. It was evident his housekeeper had been taken into consultation. After drinking it, he was too restless to sit any longer at the window, and he paced the room. His mind became more capable of consecutive thought. The room had been his study for 24 years. It had been furnished at his marriage, and all the essential equipment dated from them: the large complex writing desk, the rotating chair, the easy chair at the fire, the rotating bookcase, the fixture of indexed pigeonholes that filled the further recess. The vivid Turkey carpet, the later Victorian rugs and curtains, had mellowed now to a rich dignity of effect, and copper and brass shone warm about the open fire. Electric lights had replaced the lamp of former days. That was the chief alteration in the original equipment. But among these things his connection with the food had left abundant traces. Along one wall, above the dado, ran a crowded array of black-framed photographs and photogravures, showing his son and Cossar's sons and others of the Boom children at various ages and amidst various surroundings. Even young Caddle's vacant visage had its place in that collection. In the corner stood a sheaf of the tassels of gigantic meadow grass from Cheesing Eyebright, and on the desk there lay 3 empty poppy heads as big as hats. The curtain rods were grass stems, and the tremendous skull of the great hog of Oakham hung, a pretentious ivory overmantel, with a Chinese jar in either eye socket, snout down above the fire. It was to the photographs that Redwood went, and in particular to the photographs of his son. They brought back countless memories of things that had passed out of his mind, of the early days of the food, of Bensington's timid presence, of his cousin Jane, of Cossar and the night work at the experimental farm. These things came to him now very little and bright and distinct, like things seen through a telescope on a sunny day. And then there was the giant nursery, the giant childhood, the young giant's first efforts to speak, his first clear signs of affection. Guns? It flowed in on him, irresistibly, overwhelmingly, that outside there, outside this accursed silence and mystery, his son, and Cossar's sons, and all these glorious first fruits of a greater age, were even now fighting for life. Even now, his son might be in some dismal quandary, cornered, wounded, overcome. He swung away from the pictures and went up and down the room, gesticulating. "It cannot be," he cried. "It cannot be. It cannot end like that." What was that? He stopped, stricken, rigid. The trembling of the windows had begun again, and then had come a thud, a vast concussion that shook the house. The concussion seemed to last for an age. It must have been very near. For a moment it seemed that something had struck the house above him, an enormous impact that broke into a tinkle of falling glass, and then a stillness that ended at last with a minute clear sound of running feet in the street below. Those feet released him from his rigor. He turned towards the window and saw it starred and broken. His heart beat high with a sense of crisis, of conclusive occurrence, of release. And then, again, his realization of impotent confinement fell about him like a curtain. He could see nothing outside except that the small electric lamp opposite was not lighted. He could hear nothing after the first suggestion of a wide alarm. He could add nothing to interpret or enlarge that mystery, except that presently there came a reddish fluctuating brightness in the sky towards the southeast. This light waxed and waned. When it waned, he doubted if it had ever waxed. It had crept upon him very gradually with the darkling. It became the predominant fact in his long night of suspense. Sometimes it seemed to him it had the quiver one associates with dancing flames. At others, he fancied it was no more than the normal reflection of the evening lights. It waxed and waned through the long hours, and only vanished at last when it was submerged altogether under the rising tide of dawn. Did it mean? What could it mean? Almost certainly it was some sort of fire, near or remote, but he could not even tell whether it was smoke or cloud drift that streamed across the sky. But about 1 o'clock there began a flickering of searchlights athwart that ruddy tumult, a flickering that continued for the rest of the night. That, too, might mean many things. What could it mean? What did it mean? Just this stained, unrestful sky he had, and the suggestion of a huge explosion to occupy his mind. There came no further sounds, no further running, nothing but a shouting that might have been only the distant efforts of drunken men. He did not turn up his lights. He stood at his draughty, broken window, a distressful, slight, black outline to the officer who looked ever and again into the room and exhorted him to rest. All night Redwood remained at his window, peering up at the ambiguous drift of the sky, and only with the coming of dawn did he obey his fatigue and lie down upon the little bed they had prepared for him between his writing desk and the sinking fire in the fireplace under the great hog's skull. 3. For 36 long hours did Redwood remain imprisoned, closed in and shut off from the great drama of the 2 days, while the little people in the dawn of greatness fought against the children of the food. Then, abruptly, the iron curtain rose again, and he found himself near the very center of the struggle. That curtain rose as unexpectedly as it fell. In the late afternoon he was called to the window by the clatter of a cab that stopped without. A young man descended, and in another minute stood before him in the room, a slightly built young man of 30, perhaps, clean-shaven, well-dressed, well-mannered. "Mr. Redwood, sir," he began, "would you be willing to come to Mr. Catterham? He needs your presence very urgently." Needs my presence? There leapt a question into Redwood's mind that for a moment he could not put. He hesitated. Then, in a voice that broke, he asked, "What has he done to my son?" and stood breathless for the reply. "Your son, sir. Your son is doing well, so at least we gather." "Doing well?" "He was wounded, sir, yesterday. Have you not heard?" Redwood smote these pretenses aside. His voice was no longer colored by fear, but by anger. "You know I have not heard. You know I have heard nothing." "Mr. Catterham feared, sir. It was a time of upheaval, everyone taken by surprise. He arrested you to save you, sir, from any misadventure." "He arrested me to prevent my giving any warning or advice to my son. Go on. Tell me what has happened. Have you succeeded? Have you killed them all?" The young man made a pace or so towards the window and turned. "No, sir," he said concisely. "What have you to tell me?" "It's our proof, sir, that this fighting was not planned by us. They found us totally unprepared." "You mean?" "I mean, sir, the giants have, to a certain extent, held their own." The world changed for Redwood. For a moment something like hysteria had the muscles of his face and throat. Then he gave vent to a profound "Ah!" His heart bounded towards exultation. The giants have held their own. "There has been terrible fighting, terrible destruction. It is all a most hideous misunderstanding. In the North and Midlands, giants have been killed, everywhere." "They are fighting now?" "No, sir. There was a flag of truce." "From them?" "No, sir. Mr. Catterham sent a flag of truce. The whole thing is a hideous misunderstanding. That is why he wants to talk to you and put his case before you. They insist, sir, that you should intervene." Redwood interrupted. "Do you know what happened to my son?" he asked. "He was wounded." "Tell me, tell me." "He and the princess came before the movement to surround the Cossar camp was complete, the Cossar pit at Chislehurst. They came suddenly, sir, crashing through a dense thicket of giant oats near the river upon a column of infantry. Soldiers had been very nervous all day, and this produced a panic." "They shot him?" "No, sir. They ran away. Some shot at him, wildly, against orders." Redwood gave a note of denial. "It's true, sir. Not on account of your son, I won't pretend, but on account of the princess." "Yes, that's true." "The two giants ran shouting towards the encampment. The soldiers ran this way and that, and then some began firing. They say they saw him stagger." "Ugh." "Yes, sir, but we know he is not badly hurt." "How?" "He sent the message, sir, that he was doing well." "To me?" "Who else, sir?" Redwood stood for nearly a minute with his arms tightly folded, taking this in. Then his indignation found a voice. "Because you were fools in doing the thing, because you miscalculated and blundered, you would like me to think you are not murderers in intention. And besides, the rest?" The young man looked interrogation. "The other giants?" The young man made no further pretense of misunderstanding. His tone fell. 13, sir, are dead." "And others wounded?" "Yes, sir." "And Catterham," he gasped, "wants to meet me. Where are the others?" "Some got to the encampment during the fighting, sir. They seem to have known—" "Well, of course they did. If it hadn't been for Cossar. Cossar is there?" "Yes, sir. And all the surviving giants are there. The ones who didn't get to the camp in the fighting have gone, or are going now, under the flag of truce." "That means," said Redwood, "that you are beaten." "We are not beaten. No, sir, you cannot say we are beaten. But your sons have broken the rules of war. Once last night, and now again, after our attack had been withdrawn. This afternoon they began to bombard London." "That's legitimate." "They have been firing shells filled with poison." "Poison?" "Yes, poison. The food." Heracleophobia.
Yes, sir. Mr. Catterham, sir.
You are beaten. Of course that beats you. It's Cossar. What can you hope to do now? What good is it to do anything now? You will breathe it in the dust of every street. What is there to fight for more? Rules of war, indeed. And now Catterham wants to humbug me to help him bargain. Good heavens, man, why should I come to your exploded windbag? He has played his game, murdered and muddled. Why should I? The young man stood, with an air of vigilant respect.
It is a fact, sir, he interrupted, that the giants insist that they shall see you. They will have no ambassador but you. Unless you come to them, I am afraid, sir, there will be more bloodshed.
On your side, perhaps.
No, sir, on both sides. The world is resolved, the thing must end.
Redwood looked about the study. His eyes rested for a moment on the photograph of his boy. He turned and met the expectation of the young man. "Yes," he said at last, "I will come." 4. His encounter with Catterham was entirely different from his anticipation. He had seen the man only twice in his life, once at dinner and once in the lobby of the house, and his imagination had been active not with the man, but with the creation of the newspapers and caricaturists, the legendary Catterham, Jack the Giant Killer, Perseus, and all the rest of it. The element of a human personality came in to disorder all that. Here was not the face of the caricatures and portraits, but the face of a worn and sleepless man, lined and drawn, yellow in the whites of the eyes, a little weakened about the mouth. Here, indeed, were the red-brown eyes, the black hair, the distinctive aquiline profile of the great demagogue, but here was also something else that smote any premeditated scorn and rhetoric aside. This man was suffering. He was suffering acutely. He was under enormous stress. From the beginning, he had an air of impersonating himself. Presently, with a single gesture, the slightest movement, he revealed to Redwood that he was keeping himself up with drugs. He moved a thumb to his waistcoat pocket, and then, after a few sentences more, threw concealment aside, and slipped the little tabloid to his lips. Moreover, in spite of the stresses upon him, in spite of the fact that he was in the wrong and Redwood's junior by a dozen years, that strange quality in him, the something, personal magnetism one may call it for want of a better name, that had won his way for him to this eminence of disaster, was with him still. On that also Redwood had failed to reckon. From the first, so far as the course and conduct of their speech went, Catterham prevailed over Redwood. All the quality of the first phase of their meeting was determined by him. All the tone and procedure were his. That happened as if it was a matter of course. All Redwood's expectations vanished at his presence. He shook hands before Redwood remembered that he meant to parry that familiarity. He pitched the note of their conference from the outset, sure and clear, as a search for expedients under a common catastrophe. If he made any mistake, it was when, ever and again, his fatigue got the better of his immediate attention, and the habit of the public meeting carried him away. Then he drew himself up. Through all the interview both men stood, and looked away from Redwood, and began to fence and justify. Once he even said, "Gentlemen!" Quietly, expandingly, he began to talk. There were moments when Redwood ceased even to feel himself an interlocutor, when he became the mere auditor of a monologue. He became the privileged spectator of an extraordinary phenomenon. He perceived something almost like a specific difference between himself and this being whose beautiful voice enveloped him, who was talking. This mind before him was so powerful and so limited. From its driving energy, its personal weight, its invincible oblivion to certain things, there sprang up in Redwood's mind the most grotesque and strange of images. Instead of an antagonist who was a fellow creature, a man one could hold morally responsible, and to whom one could address reasonable appeals, he saw Catterham as something like a monstrous rhinoceros, as it were, A civilized rhinoceros, begotten of the jungle of democratic affairs, a monster of irresistible onset and invincible resistance. In all the crashing conflicts of that tangle, he was supreme. And beyond? This man was a being supremely adapted to make his way through multitudes of men. For him, there was no fault so important as self-contradiction, no science so significant as the reconciliation of interests. Economic realities, topographical necessities, the barely touched mines of scientific expedients existed for him no more than railways or rifled guns or geographical literature exist for his animal prototype. What did exist were gatherings and caucuses and votes. Above all, votes. He was votes incarnate. Millions of votes. And now, in the great crisis, with the giants broken but not beaten, this vote monster talked. It was so evident that even now he had everything to learn. He did not know there were physical laws and economic laws, quantities and reactions that all humanity voting nemine contradicente cannot vote away, and that are disobeyed only at the price of destruction. He did not know there are moral laws that cannot be bent by any force of glamour, or are bent only to fly back with vindictive violence. In the face of shrapnel or the Judgment Day, it was evident to Redwood that this man would have sheltered behind some curiously dodged vote of the House of Commons. What most concerned his mind now was not the powers that held the fastness away there to the south, not defeat and death, but the effect of these things upon his majority, the cardinal reality in his life. He had to defeat the giants or go under. He was by no means absolutely despairful. In this hour of his utmost failure, with blood and disaster upon his hands, and the rich promise of still more horrible disaster, with the gigantic destinies of the world towering and toppling over him, he was capable of a belief that by sheer exertion of his voice, by explaining and qualifying and restating, he might yet reconstitute his power. He was puzzled and distressed, no doubt, fatigued and suffering, but if only he could keep up, if only he could keep talking. As he talked, he seemed to Redwood to advance and recede, to dilate and contract. Redwood's share of the talk was of the most subsidiary sort, wedges, as it were, suddenly thrust in. That's all nonsense. No. It's no use suggesting that. Then why did you begin? It is doubtful if Catterham really heard him at all. Round such interpolations, Catterham's speech flowed indeed like some swift stream about a rock. There this incredible man stood, on his official hearthrug, talking with enormous power and skill, talking as though a pause in his talk, his explanations, his presentation of standpoints and lights, of considerations and expedients, would permit some antagonistic influence to leap into being, into vocal being, the only being he could comprehend. There he stood, amidst the slightly faded splendors of that official room, in which one man after another had succumbed to the belief that a certain power of intervention was the creative control of an empire. The more he talked, the more certain Redwood's sense of stupendous futility grew. Did this man realize that while he stood and talked there, the whole great world was moving, that the invincible tide of growth flowed and flowed, that there were any hours but parliamentary hours, or any weapons in the hands of the avengers of blood? Outside, darkling the whole room, a single leaf of giant Virginian creeper tapped unheeded on the pane. Redwood became anxious to end this amazing monologue, to escape to sanity and judgment, to that beleaguered camp, the fastness of the future, where at the very nucleus of greatness the suns were gathered together. For that, this talking was endured. He had a curious impression that unless this monologue ended, he would presently find himself carried away by it, that he must fight against Catterham's voice as one fights against a drug. Facts had altered and were altering beneath that spell. What was the man saying? Since Redwood had to report it to the children of the food,
In a sort of way, he perceived it did matter. He would have to listen and guard his sense of realities as well as he could. Much about blood guiltiness. That was eloquence. That didn't matter. Next. He was suggesting a convention. He was suggesting that the surviving children of the food should capitulate and go apart and form a community of their own. There were precedents, he said, for this. We would assign them territory. Where? Interjected Redwood, stooping to argue. Caterham snatched at that concession. He turned his face to Redwood's, and his voice fell to a persuasive reasonableness. That could be determined. That, he contended, was a quite subsidiary question. Then he went on to stipulate, and except for them and where they are, we must have absolute control. The food and all the fruits of the food must be stamped out. Redwood found himself bargaining. The princess? She stands apart. No, said Redwood, struggling to get back to the old footing. That's absurd. That afterwards. At any rate, we are agreed that the making of the food must stop. I have agreed to nothing. I have said nothing. But on one planet to have two races of men, one great, one small. Consider what has happened. Consider that is but a little foretaste of what might presently happen if this food has its way. Consider all you have already brought upon this world. If there is to be a race of giants, increasing and multiplying... It is not for me to argue, said Redwood. I must go to our sons. I want to go to my son. That is why I have come to you. Tell me exactly what you offer. Catterham made a speech upon his terms. The children of the food were to be given a great reservation, in North America perhaps, or Africa, in which they might live out their lives in their own fashion. But it's nonsense, said Redwood. There are other giants now abroad, all over Europe, here and there. There could be an international convention. It's not impossible. Something of the sort, indeed, has already been spoken of. But in this reservation they can live out their own lives in their own way. They may do what they like. They may make what they like. We shall be glad if they will make us things. They may be happy. Think. Provided there are no more children. Precisely. The children are for us. And so, sir, we shall save the world. We shall save it absolutely from the fruits of your terrible discovery. It is not too late for us. Only we are eager to temper expediency with mercy. Even now we are burning and searing the places their shells hit yesterday. We can get it under. Trust me, we shall get it under. But in that way, without cruelty, without injustice... And suppose the children do not agree. For the first time, Catterham looked Redwood fully in the face. They must. I don't think they will. Why should they not agree? He asked, in richly toned amazement. Suppose they don't. What can it be but war? We cannot have the thing go on. We cannot, sir. Have you scientific men no imagination? Have you no mercy? We cannot have our world trampled under a growing herd of such monsters and monstrous growths as your food has made. We cannot, and we cannot. I ask you, sir, what can it be but war? And remember, this that has happened is only a beginning. This was a skirmish, a mere affair of police. Believe me, a mere affair of police. Do not be cheated by perspective, by the immediate bigness of these newer things. Behind us is the nation, is humanity. Behind the thousands who have died, there are millions. Were it not for the fear of bloodshed, sir, behind our first attacks there would be forming other attacks even now. Whether we can kill this food or not, most assuredly we can kill your sons. You reckon too much on the things of yesterday, on the happenings of a mere score of years, on one battle. You have no sense of the slow course of history. I offer this convention for the sake of lives, not because it can change the inevitable end. If you think that your poor 24 of giants can resist all the forces of our people and of all the alien peoples who will come to our aid, if you think you can change humanity at a blow in a single generation and alter the nature and stature of man—" He flung out an arm. "Go to them now, sir. See them, for all the evil they have done, crouching among their wounded." He stopped, as though he had glanced at Redwood's son by chance. There came a pause. "Go to them," he said. "That is what I want to do." "Then go now." He turned and pressed the button of a bell. Without, in immediate response, came a sound of opening doors and hastening feet. The talk was at an end. The display was over. Abruptly, Catharine seemed to contract, to shrivel up into a yellow-faced, fagged-out, middle-sized, middle-aged man. He stepped forward as if he were stepping out of a picture, and with a complete assumption of that friendliness that lies behind all the public conflicts of our race, he held out his hand to Redwood. As if it were a matter of course, Redwood shook hands with him for the second time. Chapter the 5th. The Giant Leaguer. 1. Presently, Redwood found himself in a train going south over the Thames. He had a brief vision of the river shining under its lights, and of the smoke still going up from the place where the shell had fallen on the north bank, and where a vast multitude of men had been organized to burn the Heracleophobia out of the ground. The southern bank was dark. For some reason, even the streets were not lit. All that was clearly visible was the outlines of the tall alarm towers, and the dark bulks of flats and schools. And after a minute of peering scrutiny, he turned his back on the window and sank into thought. There was nothing more to see or do until he saw the suns. He was fatigued by the stresses of the last 2 days. It seemed to him that his emotions must needs be exhausted, but he had fortified himself with strong coffee before starting, and his thoughts ran thin and clear. His mind touched many things. He reviewed again, but now in the enlightenment of accomplished events, the manner in which the food had entered and unfolded itself in the world. "Bensington thought it might be an excellent food for infants," he whispered to himself with a faint smile. Then there came into his mind, as vivid as if they were still unsettled, his own horrible doubts after he had committed himself by giving it to his own son. From that, with a steady, unfaltering expansion, in spite of every effort of men to help and hinder, the food had spread through the whole world of man. And now? "Even if they kill them all," Redwood whispered, "the thing is done." The secret of its making was known far and wide. That had been his own work. Plants, animals, a multitude of distressful growing children would conspire irresistibly to force the world to revert again to the food, whatever happened in the present struggle. "The thing is done," he said, with his mind swinging round beyond all his controlling, to rest upon the present fate of the children and his son. Would he find them exhausted by the efforts of the battle, wounded, starving, on the verge of defeat? Or would he find them still stout and hopeful, ready for the still grimmer conflict of the morrow? His son was wounded, but he had sent a message. His mind came back to his interview with Catharine. He was roused from his thoughts by the stopping of his train in Chislehurst Station. He recognized the place by the huge rat alarm tower that crested Camden Hill, and the row of blossoming giant hemlocks that lined the road. Catharine's private secretary came to him from the other carriage, and told him that 1/2 a mile further the line had been wrecked, and that the rest of the journey was to be made in a motor car. Redwood descended upon a platform lit only by a hand lantern and swept by the cool night breeze. The quiet of that derelict, wood-set, weed-embedded suburb, for all the inhabitants had taken refuge in London at the outbreak of yesterday's conflict, became instantly impressive.
His conductor took him down the steps to where a motor car was waiting with blazing lights, the only lights to be seen, handed him over to the care of the driver, and bade him farewell. "You will do your best for us," he said with an imitation of his master's manner, as he held Redwood's hand. So soon as Redwood could be wrapped about, they started out into the night. At one moment they stood still, and then the motor car was rushing softly and swiftly down the station incline. They turned one corner and another, followed the windings of a lane of villas, and then before them stretched the road. The motor droned up to its topmost speed, and the black night swept past them. Everything was very dark under the starlight, and the whole world crouched mysteriously and was gone without a sound. Not a breath stirred the flying things by the wayside. The deserted, pallid white villas on either hand, with their black unlit windows, reminded him of a noiseless procession of skulls. The driver beside him was a silent man, or stricken into silence by the conditions of his journey. He answered Redwood's brief questions in monosyllables and gruffly. Athwart the southern sky, the beams of searchlights waved noiseless passes, the sole strange evidences of life they seemed in all that derelict world about the hurrying machine. The road was presently bordered on either side by gigantic blackthorn shoots that made it very dark, and by tall grass and big campions, huge giant dead nettles as high as trees, flickering past darkly in silhouette overhead. Beyond Keston, they came to a rising hill, and the driver went slow. At the crest he stopped. The engine throbbed and became still. "There," he said, and his big gloved finger pointed, a black misshapen thing before Redwood's eyes. Far away as it seemed, the great embankment, crested by the blaze from which the searchlight sprang, rose up against the sky. Those beams went and came among the clouds and the hilly land about them, as if they traced mysterious incantations. "I don't know," said the driver at last, and it was clear he was afraid to go on. Presently a searchlight swept down the sky to them, stopped as it were with a start, scrutinized them, a blinding stare confused rather than mitigated by an intervening monstrous weed stem or so. They sat with their gloves held over their eyes, trying to look under them and meet that light. "Go on," said Redwood after a while. The driver still had his doubts. He tried to express them and died down to, "I don't know," again. At last he ventured on. "Here goes," he said, and roused his machinery to motion again, followed intently by that great white eye. To Redwood, it seemed for a long time they were no longer on Earth, but in a state of palpitating hurry through a luminous cloud. Toif, 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 went the machine, and ever and again, obeying I know not what nervous impulse, the driver sounded his horn. They passed into the welcome darkness of a high-fenced lane, and down into a hollow, and past some houses, into that blinding stare again. Then for a space the road ran naked across a down, and they seemed to hang, throbbing, in immensity. Once more giant weeds rose about them and whirled past. Then, quite abruptly close upon them, loomed the figure of a giant, shining brightly where the searchlight caught him below, and black against the sky above. "Hello there!" he cried, and, "Stop! There's no more road beyond. Is that Father Redwood?" Redwood stood up and gave a vague shout by way of answer, and then Cossar was in the road beside him, gripping both hands with both of his and pulling him out of the car. "What of my son?" asked Redwood. "He's all right," said Cossar. "They've hurt nothing serious in him." "And your lads?" "Well, all of them well. But we've had to make a fight for it." The giant was saying something to the motor driver. Redwood stood aside as the machine wheeled round, and then, suddenly, Cossar vanished. Everything vanished, and he was in absolute darkness for a space. The glare was following the motor back to the crest of the Keston Hill. He watched the little conveyance receding in that white halo. It had a curious effect, as though it was not moving at all, and the halo was.
A group of war-blasted giant elders flashed into gaunt-scarred gesticulations and were swallowed again by the night. Redwood turned to Cosser's dim outline again and clasped his hand. "I have been shut up and kept in ignorance," he said, "for 2 whole days." "We fired the food at them," said Cosser. "Obviously. 30 shots, eh?" "I come from Caterham." "I know you do." He laughed with a note of bitterness. "I suppose he's wiping it up." 2. "Where is my son?" said Redwood. "He's all right. The giants are waiting for your message." "Yes, but my son—" He passed with Cosser down a long slanting tunnel that was lit red for a moment and then became dark again, and came out presently into the great pit of shelter the giants had made. Redwood's first impression was of an enormous arena bounded by very high cliffs, and with its floor greatly encumbered. It was in darkness, save for the passing reflections of the watchmen's searchlights that whirled perpetually high overhead, and for a red glow that came and went from a distant corner, where 2 giants worked together amidst a metallic clangor. Against the sky, as the glare came about, his eye caught the familiar outlines of the old work-sheds and play-sheds that were made for the Cosser boys. They were hanging now, as it were, at a cliff brow, and strangely twisted and distorted with the guns of Caterham's bombardment. There were suggestions of huge gun emplacements above there, and nearer were piles of mighty cylinders that were perhaps ammunition. All about the wide space below, the forms of great engines and incomprehensible bulks were scattered in vague disorder. The giants appeared and vanished among these masses and in the uncertain light. Great shapes they were, not disproportionate to the things amidst which they moved. Some were actively employed, some sitting and lying as if they courted sleep, and one, near at hand, whose body was bandaged, lay on a rough litter of pine boughs and was certainly asleep. Redwood peered at these dim forms. His eyes went from one stirring outline to another. "Where is my son, Cosser?" Then he saw him. His son was sitting under the shadow of a great wall of steel. He presented himself as a black shape recognizable only by his pose. His features were invisible. He sat chin upon hand, as though weary or lost in thought. Beside him, Redwood discovered the figure of the princess, the dark suggestion of her merely, and then, as the glow from the distant iron returned, he saw for an instant, red-lit and tender, the infinite kindliness of her shadowed face. She stood looking down upon her lover, with her hand resting against the steel. It seemed that she whispered to him. Redwood would have gone towards them. "Presently," said Cosser. "First, there is your message." "Yes," said Redwood, "but—" He stopped. His son was now looking up and speaking to the princess, but in too low a tone for them to hear. Young Redwood raised his face, and she bent down towards him and glanced aside before she spoke. "But if we are beaten," they heard the whispered voice of young Redwood. She paused, and the red blaze showed her eyes bright with unshed tears. She bent nearer him and spoke still lower. There was something so intimate and private in their bearing, in their soft tones, that Redwood, who had thought for 2 whole days of nothing but his son, felt himself intrusive there. Abruptly he was checked. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he realized how much more a son may be to his father than a father can ever be to a son. He realized the full predominance of the future over the past. Here, between these two, he had no part. His part was played. He turned to Cosser in the instant realization. Their eyes met. His voice was changed to the tone of a gray resolve. "I will deliver my message now," he said. "Afterwards, it will be soon enough then." The pit was so enormous and so encumbered that it was a long and tortuous route to the place from which Redwood could speak to them all. He and Cosser followed a steeply descending way that passed beneath an arch of interlocking machinery, and so came into a vast, deep gangway that ran athwart the bottom of the pit. This gangway, wide and vacant, and yet relatively narrow, conspired with everything about it to enhance Redwood's sense of his own littleness. It became, as it were, an excavated gorge. High overhead, separated from him by cliffs of darkness, the searchlights wheeled and blazed, and the shining shapes went to and fro. Giant voices called to one another above there, calling the giants together to the council of war, to hear the terms that Catharine had sent. The gangway still inclined downward towards black vastnesses, towards shadows and mysteries and inconceivable things, into which Redwood went slowly with reluctant footsteps, and Cossor with a confident stride. Redwood's thoughts were busy. The two men passed into the completest darkness, and Cossor took his companion's wrist. They went now slowly perforce. Redwood was moved to speak. "All this," he said, "is strange." "Big," said Cossor. "Strange. And strange that it should be strange to me. I, who am, in a sense, the beginning of it all. It's—" He stopped, wrestling with his elusive meaning, and threw an unseen gesture at the cliff. "I have not thought of it before. I have been busy, and the years have passed. But here I see. It is a new generation, Cossor, and new emotions, and new needs. All this, Cossor—" Cossor saw now his dim gesture to the things about them. "All this is youth." Cossor made no answer, and his irregular footfalls went striding on. "It isn't our youth, Cossor. They are taking things over. They are beginning upon their own emotions, their own experiences, their own way. We have made a new world, and it isn't ours. It isn't even sympathetic. This great place—" "I planned it," said Cossor, his face close. "But now—" "I have given it to my sons." Redwood could feel the loose wave of the arm that he could not see. "That is it. We are over, or almost over." "Your message?" "Yes, and then?" "We're over." "Well?" "Of course we are out of it, we two old men," said Cossor with his familiar note of sudden anger. "Of course we are, obviously. Each man for his own time. And now it's their time beginning. That's all right. Excavators gang. We do our job and go. See? That is what death is for. We work out all our little brains and all our little emotions, and then this lot begins afresh. Fresh and fresh. Perfectly simple. What's the trouble?" He paused to guide Redwood to some steps. "Yes," said Redwood, "but one feels—" He left his sentence incomplete. "That is what death is for," he heard Cossor below him insisting. "How else could the thing be done? That is what death is for." 3. After devious windings and ascents, they came out upon a projecting ledge from which it was possible to see over the greater extent of the giant's pit, and from which Redwood might make himself heard by the whole of their assembly. The giants were already gathered below and about him at different levels, to hear the message he had to deliver. The eldest son of Cossor stood on the bank overhead, watching the revelations of the searchlights, for they feared a breach of the truce. The workers at the great apparatus in the corner stood out clear in their own light. They were near stripped. They turned their faces towards Redwood, but with a watchful reference ever and again to the castings that they could not leave. He saw these nearer figures with a fluctuating indistinctness, by lights that came and went, and the remoter ones still less distinctly. They came from and vanished again into the depths of great obscurities. For these giants had no more light than they could help in the pit, that their eyes might be ready to see effectually any attacking force that might spring upon them out of the darkness around. Ever and again, some chance glare would pick out and display this group or that of tall and powerful forms, the giants from Sunderland clothed in overlapping metal plates, and the others clad in leather, in woven rope, or in woven metal, as their conditions had determined. They sat amidst, or rested their hands upon, or stood erect among machines and weapons as mighty as themselves, and all their faces, as they came and went from visible to invisible, had steadfast eyes. He made an effort to begin, and did not do so.
Then for a moment his son's face glowed out in a hot insurgence of the fire, his son's face, looking up to him, tender as well as strong. And at that he found a voice to reach them all, speaking across a gulf, as it were, to his son. "I come from Catharine," he said. "He sent me to you to tell you the terms he offers." He paused. "They are impossible terms, I know, now that I see you here all together. They are impossible terms, but I brought them to you because I wanted to see you all, and my son. Once more, I wanted to see my son." "Tell them the terms," said Chaucer. "This is what Catharine offers. He wants you to go apart and leave his world." "Where?" "He does not know. Vaguely, somewhere in the world, a great region is to be set apart. And you are to make no more of the food, to have no children of your own, to live in your own way for your own time, and then to end forever." He stopped. "And that is all?" "That is all." There followed a great stillness. The darkness that veiled the giants seemed to look thoughtfully at him. He felt a touch at his elbow, and Chaucer was holding a chair for him, a queer fragment of doll's furniture amidst these piled immensities. He sat down and crossed his legs, and then put one across the knee of the other, and clutched his boot nervously, and felt small and self-conscious and acutely visible and absurdly placed. Then, at the sound of a voice, he forgot himself again. "You have heard, brothers," said this voice out of the shadows. And another answered, "We have heard." And the answer, brothers, to Catterham, is no. And then? There was a silence for the space of some seconds. Then a voice said, "These people are right. After their lights, that is. They have been right in killing all that grew larger than its kind, beast and plant and all manner of great things that arose. They were right in trying to massacre us. They are right now in saying we must not marry our kind. According to their lights, they are right. They know, it is time that we also knew, that you cannot have pygmies and giants in one world together. Catterham has said that again and again, clearly, their world or ours." "We are not 100 now," said another, "and they are endless millions." "So it may be, but the thing is as I have said." Then another long silence. "And are we to die then?" "God forbid!" "Are they?" "No." "But that is what Catterham says. He would have us live out our lives, die one by one, till only one remains, and that one at last would die also, and they would cut down all the giant plants and weeds, kill all the giant underlife, burn out the traces of the food, make an end to us and to the food forever. Then the little pygmy world would be safe. They would go on, safe forever, living their little pygmy lives, doing pygmy kindnesses and pygmy cruelties each to the other. They might even perhaps attain a sort of pygmy millennium, make an end to war, make an end to overpopulation, sit down in a worldwide city to practice pygmy arts, worshipping one another till the world begins to freeze." In the corner, a sheet of iron fell in thunder to the ground. "Brothers, we know what we mean to do." In a spluttering of light from the searchlights, Redwood saw earnest, youthful faces turning to his son. "It is easy now to make the food. It would be easy for us to make food for all the world." "You mean, Brother Redwood," said a voice out of the darkness, "that it is for the little people to eat the food? What else is there to do? We are not 100, and they are many millions. But we held our own, so far. If it is God's will, we may still hold our own." "Yes, but think of the dead." Another voice took up the strain. "The dead," it said. "Think of the unborn." "Brothers," came the voice of young Redwood, "what can we do but fight them, and if we beat them, make them take the food? They cannot help but take the food now. Suppose we were to resign our heritage and do this folly that Catterham suggests. Suppose we could. Suppose we give up this great thing that stirs within us, repudiate this thing our fathers did for us, that you, father, did for us,
and pass when our time has come into decay and nothingness, what then? Will this little world of theirs be as it was before? They may fight against greatness in us who are the children of men, but can they conquer? Even if they should destroy us, every one, what then? Would it save them? No. For greatness is abroad, not only in us, not only in the food, but in the purpose of all things. It is in the nature of all things. It is part of space and time. To grow and still to grow, from first to last, that is being. That is the law of life. What other law can there be? To help others? To grow. It is still to grow, unless we help them to fail. They will fight hard to overcome us, said a voice. And another, what of that? They will fight, said young Redwood. If we refuse these terms, I doubt not they will fight. Indeed, I hope they will be open and fight. If after all they offer peace, it will be only the better to catch us unawares. Make no mistake, brothers, in some way or other they will fight. The war has begun, and we must fight to the end. Unless we are wise, we may find presently we have lived only to make them better weapons against our children and our kind. This, so far, has only been the dawn of battle. All our lives will be a battle. Some of us will be killed in battle, some of us will be waylaid. There is no easy victory, no victory whatever that is not more than half defeat for us. Be sure of that. What of that? If only we keep a foothold, if only we leave behind us a growing host to fight when we are gone. And tomorrow? We will scatter the food, we will saturate the world with the food. Suppose they come to terms? Our terms are the food. It is not as though little and great could live together in any perfection of compromise. It is one thing or the other. What right have parents to say, "My child shall have no light but the light I have had, shall grow no greater than the greatness to which I have grown"? Do I speak for you, brothers? Assenting murmurs answered him. And to the children who will be women as well as to the children who will be men, said a voice from the darkness. Even more so, to be mothers of a new race. But for the next generation there must be great and little, said Redwood, with his eyes on his son's face. For many generations, and the little will hamper the great, and the great press upon the little. So it must needs be, father. There will be conflict. Endless conflict, endless misunderstanding. All life is that. Great and little cannot understand one another. But in every child born of man, Father Redwood, lurks some seed of greatness, waiting for the food. Then I am to go to Catharine again and tell him. You will stay with us, Father Redwood. Our answer goes to Catharine at dawn. He says that he will fight. So be it, said young Redwood, and his brethren murmured assent. The iron waits, cried a voice, and the two giants who were working in the corner began a rhythmic hammering that made a mighty music to the scene. The metal glowed out far more brightly than it had done before, and gave Redwood a clearer view of the encampment than had yet come to him. He saw the oblong space to its full extent, with the great engines of warfare ranged ready to hand. Beyond, and at a higher level, the house of the Cossers stood. About him were the young giants, huge and beautiful, glittering in their mail, amidst the preparations for the morrow. The sight of them lifted his heart. They were so easily powerful. They were so tall and gracious. They were so steadfast in their movements. There was his son amongst them, and the first of all giant women, the princess. There leapt into his mind the oddest contrast, a memory of Bensington, very bright and little. Bensington, with his hand amidst the soft breast feathers of that first great chick, standing in that conventionally furnished room of his, peering over his spectacles dubiously as Cousin Jane banged the door. It had all happened in a yesterday of 21 years. Then suddenly a strange doubt took hold of him, that this place and present greatness were but the texture of a dream, that he was dreaming, and would in an instant wake to find himself in his study again, the giants slaughtered, the food suppressed, and himself a prisoner locked in.
What else indeed was life but that, always to be a prisoner, locked in? This was the culmination and end of his dream. He would wake, through bloodshed and battle, to find his food the most foolish of fancies, and his hopes and faith of a greater world to come no more than the colored film upon a pool of bottomless decay. Littleness invincible. So strong and deep was this wave of despondency, this suggestion of impending disillusionment, that he started to his feet. He stood and pressed his clenched fists into his eyes, and so for a moment remained, fearing to open them again and see, lest the dream should already have passed away. The voice of the giant children spoke to one another, an undertone to that clangorous melody of the smiths. His tide of doubt ebbed. He heard the giant voices, he heard their movements about him still. It was real. Surely it was real. As real as spiteful acts. More real, for these great things, it may be, are the coming things, and the littleness, bestiality, and infirmity of men are the things that go. He opened his eyes. "Done!" cried one of the two ironworkers, and they flung their hammers down. A voice sounded above. The son of Cossor, standing on the great embankment, had turned and was now speaking to them all. "It is not that we would oust the little people from the world," he said, "in order that we, who are no more than one step upwards from their littleness, may hold their world forever. It is the step we fight for, and not ourselves. We are here, brothers, to what end? To serve the spirit and the purpose that has been breathed into our lives. We fight not for ourselves, for we are but the momentary hands and eyes of the life of the world. So you, Father Redwood, taught us. Through us and through the little folk, the spirit looks and learns. From us by word and birth and act it must pass to still greater lives. This earth is no resting place. This earth is no playing place, else indeed we might put our throats to the little people's knife, having no greater right to live than they. And they in their turn might yield to the ants and vermin. We fight not for ourselves, but for growth, growth that goes on forever. Tomorrow, whether we live or die, growth will conquer through us. That is the law of the spirit forevermore. To grow according to the will of God, to grow out of these cracks and crannies, out of these shadows and darknesses, into greatness and the light. Greater, he said, speaking with slow deliberation. Greater, my brothers, and then still greater. To grow, and again to grow. To grow at last into the fellowship and understanding of God. Growing till the earth is no more than a footstool, till the spirit shall have driven fear into nothingness, and spread, he swung his arm heavenward, there. His voice ceased. The white glare of one of the searchlights wheeled about, and for a moment fell upon him, standing out gigantic, with hand upraised against the sky. For one instant he shone, looking up fearlessly into the starry deeps, mail-clad, young and strong, resolute and still. Then the light had passed, and he was no more than a great black outline against the starry sky. A great black outline that threatened with one mighty gesture the firmament of heaven and all its multitude of stars. End of chapter 5, and end of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. Thank you for listening.